I'm a 30-year-old woman living in Texas, and I've met my fair share of creeps. But what happened to me yesterday takes the cake. I don't drive and I work in another city, so I have to commute to and from work, using mostly the bus and the same stops on a daily basis. I just started using public transportation last year, so I'm mostly pretty comfortable with it by now, which makes yesterday's experience all the more unnerving. I have gone to the store after work for some soda, so I had a reusable bag with 2 liters in one hand and my purse in the other. Approaching the bus stop, I saw a woman sitting inside. It's one of these shelter types, and while I'm normally very shy and won't sit down if someone is in there, I considered it because I was feeling fairly sick and my feet hurt after being on them all day. That idea quickly disappeared when I got closer and could hear her muttering to herself. I did a quick glance over as I walked past and could see that she had her bag spread out over that side of the bench and her shoes were off. So I concluded that she was probably homeless, and since her muttering to herself definitely put me on edge, I walked past the stop to maybe 2 yards away or so and set the reusable bag down. Uncomfortable, I pull out my phone and begin to text my best friend to tell her, and this is about when I start noticing what she's saying. Things like, "Don't call me sweetie, I'll freaking kill you." Okay, hackles raised even more, and I'm so curious to take a peek over, and I figure it's probably best not to risk antagonizing her at all, so I don't want to turn her attention to me. I keep messaging with my friends and the lady is muttering the entire time. Things like, "Don't call me sweetie, don't call me honey, don't call me anything." She's also saying things that I can't quite catch, but one I did was, "I'll wrap my hands around your throat and kill you." At this point, I'm thinking maybe I should just nope it out of there. But the bus is set to arrive any minute, and even though the station is just down the street, I'm reluctant to try for it because I really just want to get home. It's stupid, I know, but she hadn't done anything to make me think that she'd even noticed that I'd existed yet. Around this time, I hear her begin saying things about a fat ass. Now, this certainly alarms me, as I'm not a slim woman, and an ass is a fairly gender-specific word. But what sends shivers down my spine is when I hear, "Your phone doesn't scare me." Clearly, she's speaking about to me now, as I've had my phone out since I got here. Just as I'm about to grab my bag, I look to the side, and she's now outside of the shelter staring at me with a look of intense hatred. There's still maybe 1 or 1.5 yards between us, but it's not enough to make me risk leaning over to pick up that bag and possibly give her an opening. She starts again with how I've got to stop calling her sweetie, but now I can hear the other stuff that I was missing before. Things about how she wasn't going to screw me, she wasn't going to worship me, I wasn't going to cost her morals or her relationship with God, and just all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm looking anywhere at this woman, completely terrified as she keeps talking about attacking me and putting her hands around my neck. She sits back down, and I completely, idiotically, am frozen to the spot. And I feel like I don't even dare lean over even now that she's a safe distance away. Also, this is taking place next to a very busy road that directly connects to a highway, so I think it gave me a false sense of security. She keeps muttering. I slowly come to the conclusion that my bus isn't coming and I'm now in tears. And then she gets up again. She's much more vehement now, and I'm completely terrified. The most scared I've been in my life. I see a man crossing the street, and as he steps onto the sidewalk, I take a deep breath and hope for the best. I lean over and grab my bag and nope the heck out of there, watching over my shoulder the entire way. I walk down to the next bus stop and immediately call the police to connect me to the right department. And I tell them what happened, although my physical description isn't very good since, as I told them, I hardly even glanced at her because I was really worried about antagonizing her. Not long after that, a family member happened by and gave me a ride, so I didn't have to bother with the bus at all. Also, my brother lives in an apartment complex just down the road from that stop, and he told me that she had been sleeping there for about a week, and he had had a minor encounter with her last night, so I guess they didn't find her. But she was gone this morning and still gone this afternoon, so maybe somebody else complained. I hope so, because not only do I fear for the safety of people who come into contact with her, I did legitimately fear for my safety throughout the encounter. But I feel really sorry for her, and I hope she can get the help that she needs as well. Back when I was attending university, I used to work on campus at one of the dining halls during the dinner or night shift. I lived in the next town over since it was cheaper to live in a crappy little apartment out of town than to live on campus in the dorms. But I didn't own a car, so I had to take the bus to commute. One night, I had just gotten off a shift at work. My feet were killing me and I was completely exhausted, and I slowly made my way to the bus stop. I noticed a man much older than me sitting on one of the two benches at the otherwise empty bus stop, but I didn't pay too much attention to him. I simply sat down on the second bench and listened to some music while waiting for the bus to arrive. And the first sign that things were starting to get weird was when I kept noticing out of the corner of my eye that he was staring at me. At first, I thought I might be imagining it, so I looked over and caught him quickly turning his head to look away. Okay, so he was staring at me. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary since being a young college girl seemed to gain me a bit of attention from older men. So like usual, I just ignored him. That was a mistake. Again, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him look at me. But instead of just staring at me this time, he got up and walked over to sit next to me instead. I continued listening to my music, hoping that he would see my headphones in and take the hint that I wasn't interested in talking. But instead, the man literally took them out of my ear. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said as my head snapped to look at him in shock. I should have told him off for touching my things and demanded that he leave me alone, but I was sort of frozen, and I didn't want to make him mad. Hi," I replied quietly. He started introducing himself as Mike and telling me that he lived in the area, and that it was always nice to see pretty girls like me at the university bus stop. He explained that he was a real man, unlike the boys that I went to school with, and that I should go home with him that night. I was a shy, scared girl who had never had a man be as bold as this to my face. I say to my face because I had certainly got my fair share of unsolicited private pictures online by that point, but I digress. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. But that didn't stop Mike from continuing to explain to me all of the fun things he wanted to do with me at his place that night. At that point, I wished that I was anywhere else but that bus stop. But it was just the two of us in the dark alone, as I counted these seconds until the bus would arrive. And then Mike took things to a different level of shocking by telling me, "Listen, the demons want me to ask for your phone number, and they say that you should give it to me or you won't like what happens." He actually had the audacity to start stroking my hair. His hand was gentle, but I didn't want him touching me at all. And this was shocking for a number of reasons. The demons, I wouldn't like what would happen. Why was he touching me? What the heck was this guy talking about? As though he could read my mind, Mike went on to explain. "My therapist knows the demons are real. I told her about them and she says that I'm not crazy and that the demons are real." He laughed and then abruptly stopped. "Now give me your phone number like they said," he demanded. As his hand stroked my hair for the last time, he stopped and gripped the back of my neck, still gentle but even more terrifying. I was scared, and obviously didn't want him to have my phone number, but he was taking out his phone and I knew that he was going to call the number I gave him to make sure that I wasn't lying to him. And he still had his hand on the back of my neck, so I reluctantly gave him my real phone number. It's stupid, I know, but I was right, and he immediately called a check. All I could think about was just not making this guy angry long enough to get away from him, and then I would block his number. Thankfully, the bus came moments later. I sat down as close to the front of the bus near the bus driver as I possibly could, since the bus was basically empty. Mike decided to sit directly across from me. At this point, I tried listening to music again, hoping that being on the bus and him having my phone number would signal to him to end our conversation. However, he decided to reach over and unzip my sweatshirt, revealing my work shirt and the name tag, which I had unfortunately forgotten to remove in my haste to leave work that night. I hadn't told him my name yet. Abigail, what a beautiful name. Our daughter will be named Celeste. I shouldn't have been shocked at this point, but I was. I had stopped listening to music again and zipped my sweatshirt back up, which made him laugh. "You won't need that soon anyway," he said, and he winked at me, implying how he had planned to do what he wanted to do further that night. At one stop, Mike tried to convince me to get off the bus with him. I told him no, that I was tired and just wanted to go home, and so he said okay and he stayed on the bus. I knew that had to be a stop, so the fact that he was staying in the bus worried me. I was sure this meant that he was planning on coming home with me instead. "Baby," Mike whispered to me. I tried to ignore him, but he repeated himself louder. "Baby." He had the most unsettling smile on his face as I asked, "What?" He laughed and told me, "The demons say you smell nice." I was terrified and felt like I was going to throw up by the time my bus stop arrived. I lived in an apartment alone and I didn't want to know where I lived. Despite my body being exhausted and sore from work, adrenaline kicked in and I bolted off the bus and ran straight home. I made it inside and locked the door. I looked through the peephole and I didn't see him, so I went carefully to peek out of my window and saw him standing near the bus stop, looking around. He took out his phone and sure enough, I started getting a call from an unknown number since I hadn't saved his number. I ignored it. When he hung up, I started getting several texts, asking where I had gone, how he didn't like hide and seek, and how the demons just wanted to have fun. I was so scared because he knew which apartment building I lived in, where I worked and where I went to school, my phone number and my name. The only good thing which made me feel slightly relieved was that he didn't know which specific apartment number I lived in. And that's when he started yelling outside. There were no specific words said, just wordless yells of what I could only assume were frustration and anger. I blocked his number and I kept all the lights in my apartment off as I cried with my back to the front door. Maybe I should have called the police, but my brain was so frazzled that I didn't even think of that until the next day. And by then, all I knew about him was that he was a mentally unstable man, probably named Mike, who hadn't actually done any physical harm to me, so I didn't think that it was worth it. In hindsight, I know that I made a lot of stupid mistakes during his experience. I ended up moving away entirely at the end of that term of school for unrelated reasons, but until then, I switched to day shifts at work and was paranoid every night. Thankfully, I never saw the man again though. I'd like to preface this by saying that not all mental health professionals are bad people. Good doctors and medication have saved my life. I also didn't grow up in the US, so if you see something in this story that makes you go, that's not how it works. Keep in mind that other countries might have different laws. And furthermore, this describes my experiences with staying at a mental hospital, so prepare for triggers. Alright, here we go. I was a troubled kid. I'm kind of a troubled person in general. But when I was in my early teens, specifically in this story I was 14, I was doing some bad stuff and refusing to go to school. So I was put on a waiting list for a children's mental hospital. I know now that the fact that I was on that waiting list for close to half a year should have been the first warning sign. At the time, I enjoyed being on sick leave from school, which basically meant I got to play The Sims until 6 in the morning for 5 months straight. But when I had to pack my stuff to actually go to the hospital, I, of course, didn't really want to go. I wanted to get help, don't get me wrong, but the idea of being away from home for 6 weeks, which is the standard time they take to analyze and watch you to give you a diagnosis, after which you can choose to pursue treatment, it scared me. I arrived at the hospital in tears, my mom carrying my suitcase for me. The nurses noticed that obviously I didn't want to stay. "Are you here on your own free will?" the doctor asked me. I shook my head. They just shrugged it off, saying they could get a judicial decision forcing me to stay there. I never go to talk to a judge. I never got to defend or explain myself. And as far as I know, my parents didn't talk to a judge either. A judge glossed over my medical history and then signed a piece of paper that forced me to stay in this place for 6 weeks. The contents of my suitcase were searched, and I remember feeling like I had just arrived in prison. The first terrifying thing happened to me on my first night. I had scratched open some of my old scabs, and when I went to the nurse to ask for a bandage, everyone went nuts. In their eyes, I had purposely harmed myself, which they couldn't prove, but okay. So what do you do when a 14-year-old mental patient does this? You talk to her, you try to help. No, you take away all their jewelry, a necklace from my mom and a bracelet from my ex-girlfriend, who at the time I still had very strong feelings for her, and send her off to the timeout room for 24 hours. The timeout room was a small room with a big window that could just barely fit a bed. If I'd use the bathroom, I'd ask a nurse to accompany me. And no joke, at one point I was in the bathroom, with a nurse standing guard in front of the door. She asked if I was doing okay, and I sarcastically responded with, "No." She goes, "Really?" and she ripped the door open. All of my clothes were taken from my room and kept in the front office for the time I stayed in the timeout room. So whenever I needed them, I had to go up to the front office to ask for them. But apart from having to ask for clothing and the bathroom trips, I was completely left alone in that room. No one ever came to check up on me. Getting out of the timeout room wasn't a lot better. For the first week or two, I had bad stomach problems. I would get up multiple times a night to use the bathroom, which, by the way, you didn't have one of them in your room. You had to walk down the hall to use it. And because my stomach kept me up all night, I would often not get enough sleep and end up sleeping through the day, which led to me not partaking in group activities. And instead of, waking me up, I was yelled at, and I quote, "If I was up all night roaming the halls, I would be tired too." And because I didn't partake in group activities, I couldn't earn outside time. Yes, I had to earn going outside. Even just sitting on the front steps with a nurse right next to me had to be earned. So, for the first 6 weeks, I was effectively locked up, except for school and weekends where I was allowed to go home. It was blatantly obvious that none of the nurses really cared about any of the patients. They weren't even real nurses. They were more like prison guards. One of them straight up looked like they were homeless. Another one sounded like she had been a 5 packs a day smoker her life and all. And I mean all of them were chain smokers. Every free second they had, they would use it for smoke breaks. Right outside of the door too, with the doors open. So that all the other kids who were currently going through nicotine withdrawals could smell the cigarette smoke. Within 6 weeks of staying at the mental hospital, I saw a psychiatrist at whooping 2 times. Once for a general introduction and once for an IQ test. Anyone who's ever struggled with mental illness probably knows the sentence like, "Just pull yourself together or get over it." They're the least helpful things one could say to a mentally ill person. I've never heard it that much in my entire life. There was one instance where another patient, who was deathly afraid of spiders, came running out of her room in a borderline panic attack because she had woken up to a spider directly in front of her face. And you know what they told her? "Don't be such a baby, it's just a spider." They gave her a broom for her to get rid of the spider herself, which obviously she couldn't do. My roommate and I ended up helping her out. Both of us were scared as well, mind you. But possibly the most outrageous thing happened on my second to last day. Someone had told the guards that I had tried to smuggle in something. So they pulled me out of breakfast and searched my room top to bottom. They didn't find anything, but they found one laying on the floor in the hallway, and it was even still in its wrapper. I wasn't the only patient that did this. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was a single patient who didn't do it. The blade could have belonged to anyone. They had no proof that it was mine. But of course, it was deemed that it was mine. And despite me not having any new cuts on my arm, I was thrown into the timeout room for another 24 hours. Literally my last 24 hours. And they paid so little attention to the timeout room that a fellow inmate was able to slip a letter inside the door so I could take out my frustrations. In case any of you were wondering where my parents were in all of this, my mother wanted to get me out of that place as soon as she had heard about the timeout room. But since my parents had joint custody, she needed my father to agree to it. And my father deserves a story like this for himself, but to make it short, he hadn't talked to me in over 4 years but was somehow convinced that I needed help and refused to get me out of there. My final diagnosis from that place: narcissistic neurosis. I was 14 and to this day, I had no idea how they came up with any kind of diagnosis, considering I had seen an actual doctor a total of 2 times. Additionally, this result was delivered to us, my parents and I, by the head doctor of the hospital, who I had never seen in my life, during a conclusive meeting on my last day. I was offered to stay and start behavioral therapy, but I guess it goes without saying that I politely declined that offer. Every therapist and psychiatrist I have talked to since, and trust me, there's been a few over the last 7 years, have disregarded the diagnosis entirely. Some have even laughed at it. I'm currently diagnosed with bipolar disorder, depression, and a panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist has suggested that I might suffer from borderline personality disorder. I guess the moral of the story is to always do research on the hospital you plan on getting yourself admitted to. I'm sure as heck that I hope I never have to see any of those guards, nurses, or doctors ever again.